So we're going to start on the tribulation, but if you remember from last week, we actually didn't finish last week. So the tribulation actually begins with the starting of looking at the 70th week of Daniel. So if you remember last week, we looked at the first 69 weeks of Daniel. Dale?
We were looking at Daniel 9:27.
That's correct.
From 7 years after he stops Antichrist, abomination, desolation is where we were leaving off. And distance, something if I could actually read my own notes.
I know that's right.
Of the and this I don't know if it's disclosure or distance of the desolation of Antichrist. Something like that.
Not sure what the distance means, but
I don't know.
so we'll probably back up a little bit. I do want to review what we talked about last week. So the first 69 weeks, we can see over there on the left, we talked about the decree to restore Jerusalem, the walls of Jerusalem, and we looked at the date of that, and then we talked about the coming of Jesus and his presentation during the very first Palm Sunday, or what's the other term for the Palm Sunday? Jumped out of my head. But anyway, when he presented himself as the Messiah to the Jewish nation, and we noted that date, the triumphal entry. It's right up there. So we noted the fact that those were exactly 69 weeks of years, 7 years, and so it actually turned out to be 483 years of 360-day years, and we sort of looked at why all that was last week. I don't want to regroup all of that. And then we what I remember us leaving off at is talking about this gap and about how the distance, the period between the 69th week and the 70th week, I was proposing that there's a gap in there.
Oh, that's why it says
Okay.
distance of the desolation.
So yeah, so
The abomination of desolation to the end of the
that makes sense. Okay. So I see that and I'm going to explain tonight why I think that the Bible teaches that there's this gap in here. So we're going to look at the gap and why it's there and how we can know it's there, as opposed to us just making up something that we like and then trying to make it fit into this passage, which is what, honestly, for the longest time I believed, is that the reason I was taught from growing up in this church, well, growing up being a teenager, that there was a pre-trib, pre-millennial, that so it was similar to my current views, but I always sort of was suspicious about it because of this gap thing. I really felt like this was made up to make everything work. But I'm going to try to propose or explain to you tonight why I now believe that that's not the case, and that the Bible actually does teach that there is a gap in here. And so once we do that, then we're going to start looking at the 70th week of Daniel, which is talked about in Daniel 9:27. And we're going to look at that briefly because it's one verse, you can't look at it too long, but that's going to lead us right into talking about the tribulation. And so I'll show you how that eventually is going to take place. So let's get started. So I already popped that up right there. So I believe that the 490 years of Daniel's prophecy is, and we talked about that 70 weeks of 7 years, so that's 490 years, with 483 years already fulfilled in the time period between the rebuilding of the walls to when Jesus came and the triumphal entry. And then there's this gap that we're going to talk about, and then the 70th week. So there's another way of representing this concept that I'm trying to put forward to you. We're gap dwellers right now, in my view.
So the gap was the building of the church.
It is. The gap is the church age. And later, when I have a really nice graphic that it's nice because I stole it from somebody. Well, borrowed it from them. But it's nice in that it actually shows the gap, and it's the church age. So yes, Jesus, when the nation of Israel rejected his messiahship, that's when he turned and started focusing. The rest of that week, it's when we look at the last week of the life of Christ, he was really busy. He just wasn't sitting around waiting the 3 or 4 days till it was time for him to be crucified. He was really busy investing in the disciples. And if you look at the stuff that came out of that week, it's a lot of talking about the church and about how they're going to be establishing this. And then the Apostle Paul eventually comes along and fills in all of the missing detail that and building out this concept of the church that really wasn't talked about in the Old Testament. Um, so based on that, so I want to start here with some prophecies from the Old Testament, and I think it's going to make a point that I want you guys to understand. So we have Zechariah 9 and 10. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And I think we recognize that. That's what we were just talking about, the triumphal entry, the Palm Sunday experience where Jesus was riding into Jerusalem on a colt. And then the next verse, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, the northern kingdom. I think we talked at the very beginning about how Israel was divided eventually after Solomon. Uh, Israel was divided into two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And oftentimes the official names of them was Judah for the southern kingdom and Israel for the northern kingdom. But oftentimes Israel is called Ephraim. The northern kingdom is also called Ephraim, which is one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it was actually historically one of the strongest of the 12 tribes that wasn't Judah. And so oftentimes Israel and Ephraim are in the Old Testament are often called the same, called interchangeable. Sorry for that side trail. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horses from Jerusalem. The bow of war will be removed, and he will proclaim peace to the nations. His dominion will extend from sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. So this is obviously these two verses are obviously a prophecy about Jesus. And there's obviously a difference between verse 9 and verse 10. We recognize verse 9 is happening in the past, but we know that verse 10 hasn't happened because Jesus he hasn't proclaimed peace to the nations yet, or at least he's proclaimed it, but it's not been accepted, as we can see from our current world situation. And his dominion, his kingdom, will extend from sea to sea. So eventually he's going to come and reign here on earth. And so this is a future part of the prophecy. So we've got prophecy here that's half rooted in the past and half rooted in the future. Here's another prophecy, another one we're familiar with. Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. So obviously, again, we recognize that even from some Christmas cards. It's a prophecy around the birth of Jesus. And then verse 7, that his dominion will be vast, and its prosperity will never end. He will reign on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish and sustain it with justice and righteousness from now on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So we recognize this part of the prophecy, again, being going to be fulfilled when Jesus comes down to earth and literally reigns from Jerusalem, from the city of David. And this is talked about a lot in the New Testament, specifically in Revelations chapter 20, 21, 22, around there, but also in other places in the New Testament as well. So again, a prophecy where partial fulfilled in the past, and the rest we're waiting fulfillment in the future. Last one, the Spirit. So this is from Isaiah chapter 61. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, Because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and freedom to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of God's vengeance, to comfort all who mourn. So the first verse and half of the second verse, Jesus actually quoted. If you remember, there was a time where he went into the synagogue, and somebody handed him a scroll, and he read this out of Isaiah, but he didn't read the second part of the verse, verse 2. He just read to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and stopped. And then he handed the scroll back to the person, and he said, "Today these words are fulfilled to you in your presence." So Jesus was claiming Isaiah chapter 61 verse 1 and first part of verse 2, I'm fulfilling right now. But obviously, the day of the Lord, God's vengeance is not yet. He is not at that point yet where he's raining judgment down on this earth yet. He's still in the business of. Oh, I'm sorry. I have them both on my screen. I forgot to change. I'm so embarrassed. I'm sorry about that. So there's verse 2, the missing verse 2. So the first part, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of God's vengeance. So the day of God's vengeance is still yet in future, as God is not yet, this world is not great, but there's a lot of pain, suffering, death, disease, uh, all kinds of problems, but God's vengeance is not yet on it. It will, yes. And so, again, my point with showing these verses is we're seeing prophecies where they're partially fulfilled in the past and partially fulfilled in the future. And my point, obviously, is in argument of the gap theory, other Old Testament prophecies had these gaps as well. So when we're looking at the 70th week of Daniel, it's not unheard of for Old Testament prophecies to do this, where there's partial fulfillments and they're separated by some time. Hi, Karen. So, so that is why one of the things I would propose to say, it's not just hokey to say that there's this gap period between these verses, because the other prophecies in the Old Testament do this as well. They intermix the first coming and the second coming of Jesus together.
Verses that are right after each other.
Right. Yes. So now I didn't format that correctly because I spoiled my second point. So my first point is that, which I made in advance. The second point I'm going to make in the arrears as my second argument in favor of the gap is that the events in Daniel 9 chapter 9 verse 26 argue for the gap. And so let's take a look at that. We looked at this verse last week, but let's go back and look at it again. After those 62 weeks, we had a gap, 7 weeks of 7, so we had 49 years, and then we have 62 weeks of 7s, and those were the first 69 weeks. And so the 62 weeks is after the 7, and then after the 62 weeks. As we talked about last week, the Messiah will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the coming prince will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come with a flood, and until the end, there will be war. Desolations are decreed. So we talked about this verse last week, and we pointed out the fact that this verse, it says after the 62 weeks were over with, the Messiah will be cut off. And that was, the cutting off was when he was rejected as the Messiah, and then he will be cut off and will have nothing. Literally what that verse is saying is his actions will come to nothing, or it will appear as if they came to nothing. And so what this is saying is that not only will he be rejected as the Messiah, but he will end up being killed. And so ultimately his ministry from an earthly perspective will look like nothing came from it. So that event happened after the 69 weeks had ended, because we talked about the exact day that the 69 week ended was the Palm Sunday, or the triumphal entry. So events continued on after that point, but they're not part of the 70th week. If technically, if we were the 70th week, there was no gap, then the 70th week should have started the moment that Jesus presented himself as Messiah, and the clock should have kept going. But the fact is, the clock didn't keep going, and the proof of that, part of the proof of that, is in verse 26, where it says, after the 69 weeks, stuff is going to happen, but it's not part of the 70th week. And so the verse is suggesting that there are things that happen between the 69th week and the 70th week that are not part of the 70th week, because it's not talking about the 70th week yet. It's going to talk about the 70th week in the next verse. And so this gap is inserted between the 69th and 70th week. Not only is the Messiah, is Jesus' rejection and crucifixion in this gap here, but the second part, the people of the coming prince will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So we talked about this last week.
Nebuchadnezzar?
No, this is Titus of Rome, who came in 70 AD and destroyed Jerusalem. And we talked about how the temple was filled with gold, and it caught fire, and so the gold melted into the stone. And in fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy in Luke, literally the stones of the temple, one stone was not kept on another, because the soldiers wanted that gold. They weren't paid very well for soldiering, so all of their income came from looting. And so any scrap of gold that they got was income to them. So they literally tore the walls of the temple apart to get that gold. And so this is, again, this prophecy of the temple, or the Jerusalem being destroyed and the temple being destroyed, it happened in 70 AD. So again, we go from 33 AD to 70 AD, and we're still in the gap. So because the 70th week hasn't started yet. So we have Jesus dying, and then about 37 years later, Jerusalem is destroyed. And so we're not at the 70th week yet. So this verse is telling us that there is a gap here, that between the 69th and 70th week. It's suggesting that there are events that are going on. Otherwise, the 70th week should have started and lasted 7 years, and then it would have been over. The 70th week of Daniel would have been over with. But that didn't happen because these other things are in this part. Karen, I know you're a little lost because we're starting from where we left off last week, so we won't be here long. So
No worries.
Okay.
No.
So my second proof for the gap is the events of Daniel 9:26. The third one, point of argument, is that events in Daniel 9:24 are unfulfilled. So what I'm saying here is, let's go to Daniel 9:24. So this was the beginning of the prophecy, which is that 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. And we talked about, from Daniel's perspective, where that's the Jewish people and his holy city is Jerusalem. So this prophecy of 70 weeks is all about the Jewish people and all about Jerusalem. It's not about the world. It's not about America. It's not about the church. This prophecy is specifically Jewish related, the Jewish people and Jerusalem. And to bring the rebellion to an end, to put a stop to sin, to wipe away the iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up visions and prophecies, and to anoint the most holy place. I don't want to go back and talk about what these things meant, because I didn't do a very good job last week, as I was listening to the recording a little bit. But there's a lot of stuff in here, and quite frankly, I could probably spend 30 minutes just on this verse, just about these various points. But I think the point is, and I'll just pick the one that's most obvious, which is to bring in everlasting righteousness. That hasn't happened yet. And so if Daniel's 70 weeks were consecutive, it was 490 years consecutive, which a lot of people argue. A lot of people don't agree that the 70th week is still outstanding and that Daniel's 70th weeks ran consecutively. This hasn't been fulfilled yet. And it says that 70 weeks are decreed, and that at the end of the 70 weeks, all these things are going to happen. And none of these things have happened. And if you can, even if you want to spiritualize some of these things and argue about them, but spiritually happen them, you can't argue about bringing in everlasting righteousness. It's not here. It's not part of our world. I think we can all agree to that. And then to anoint the most holy place, again, we're talking about Daniel. We're talking about Jerusalem. Therefore, this is talking about the temple. Well, there's no temple right now, so it's not being anointed as in any special way. So again, my argument about the gap is these things remain unfulfilled. Dale.
In order to anoint the most holy place, the thing they carried around on poles. Is it
Oh, the Ark of the Covenant?
the Ark of the Covenant is either not recreated or has not been found.
Yes, I believe.
That so that would also
I believe that neither one of those statements are true. I believe that it is found, that people know exactly where it is, and as soon as, yeah, I believe that as soon as they're ready to rebuild the Jerusalem, it will suddenly appear out of as if nowhere. See, if
okay. Well, they can't anoint the most holy place because Dale doesn't know where it's
oh,
at.
okay,
I don't
fair
know.
enough. I think this they can, I don't think the Jewish people can do this. They don't have the ability to do this. This is going to be done by Jesus when he comes back and the last temple is built. The fourth temple, which is going to be the last temple. And when that's built, because the third temple, which is going to be built, so two temples have existed up till now. But the Bible talks about four total. The third one's going to happen during the tribulation period. It's going to be rebuilt and it's going to be desecrated to the midpoint, which is I'm spoiling a little bit, but um, we're going to talk about that, is what I meant by that. Um, and that it's going to be destroyed at some point. And then the fourth one's going to be built, and that's the one that's going to be consecrated. So, again, I believe that this is talking about the future fourth temple, which it will be anointed by Jesus, and that way, it'll be fully anointed.
So do you think that people who don't believe that there's a gap in between the 69th and 70th week, do they believe that the second coming has already came?
Some of these people don't. There are various theories. Some of them spiritualize all prophecy. They don't believe that any prophecy is outstanding. That all of it is being spiritually. They believe that we're in the spiritual. I remember I talked about the millennial kingdom. Some people believe that the millennial kingdom's now. They believe that Jesus is reigning from heaven. That his throne. He's sitting on his throne right now. Um, I'm suggesting that if Jesus was reigning right now, we would see a lot better um, outcome on here on earth. If nothing else, then the prophecies themselves say that when he does reign, there's going to be peace and prosperity, and people are going to flock to Jerusalem and worship. Well, none of that, even in a spiritual sense, none of that's happening right now. So but I think that they'll spiritualize what we're looking at here, and they'll look at this list and they'll come up with a spiritual aspect for every one of those things.
So when he reigns, I think it's for 1,000 years.
Yes, but so they don't believe that a little 1,000 years. They spiritualize that, and they say 1,000 years means a long, long time, or forever, or whatever.
Well, it's a long one.
So I think the problem I have with spiritualizing prophecy is once you do that, you literally can make it mean whatever you want it to mean.
Right.
And I believe that Jesus and I believe that God did not give prophecy for us to insert our own meanings into. I believe that He has a definitive meaning for the prophecy. And if that's the case, then, and as we looked at last week with the first 69 weeks of Daniel, I think if you interpret a prophecy literally, you're often going to be on the right track. Where if you decide to spiritualize it, then you can literally do anything you want with it, which is why I believe there's so many different viewpoints out there, because a lot of people don't want to take the scriptures literally for whatever reason. So, all right, so let's finish up this gap thing. So my fourth and last proof for the gap is that Jesus and Paul indicated a gap. So in their teachings, they talked about the 70th week of Daniel, um, the elements of it in a future tense. And so because they're living so Jesus is living he's living pre-gap for the most part. He was living within the 483 years. But he was looking forward, but when he gave the verses we're going to look at, he was actually this was after he was rejected as Messiah. So for him, we were technically in the 70th week, potentially, or the gap, and he was talking about these things happening in the future. So rather than talk about it, let me show you. And yes, and Paul, and even Jesus right here is living in the gap again, although really, really close to the end of it. Um, but so in Matthew chapter 24, this is the Olivet Discourse, which he had like a couple days after he the triumphal entry was didn't go as he would have liked. So he was talking to his disciples, and he was talking about the question was they came to him and said, "Okay, what are you talked you just this yeah he they literally just said, isn't the temple great?" And Jesus' response to that was, "It's going to be torn down." And they're immediately thought, okay, the temple is going to be torn down. That's going to be a horrible experience. This must be at during the end times. So that their follow up to Jesus' statement was, well, tell us about these things. When are the end time? What are the signs of the end times, and what are the signs of your coming? And so literally he answered those questions. Now, the problem is well, I don't want to get into it too much, but the problem is a lot of people take Matthew 24 and cherry pick verses out of there and make very bad doctrine out of that, out of cherry picking verses out of here. There's a context to these verses, and you can't just pull them out and say, okay, this verse means this, and this verse means this. That's a way to build bad doctrine, is by pulling verses out of context. However, unfortunately, that's one of my hot buttons. So I felt that I pushed it myself, but then I felt like I had to say what I need to say here. This, though, is Jesus talking about the tribulation. So he just talked about all these signs about earthquakes and it's going to be a terrible time, and then he ends all that a bunch of really bad things with, but the one who endures to the end will be delivered. And again, this is talking about the tribulation period. Um, the good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed to all the world. Now, the good news of the kingdom, that's also another hint that this is the tribulation. But that's something we're not going to talk about. So I just throw that out there as a bone, and then I'm going to walk away from it. But the good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So then he says this. So when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, so he's referring to the verse we're about to look at, because we still haven't got to verse 27 yet. Standing in the holy place. So again, that'll make sense in a minute, and we'll come back to this verse. Then let the reader understand. So Jesus says, hey, you're going to someday, when the end is coming, you're going to see this event happen. This event this abomination that causes desolation that Daniel spoke of. When you see this happen towards the end, you're going to know that you're near the end. And so my point simply here is that Jesus puts that event in the future, which means he's indicating that there's going to be a gap between the 69th and 70th week, because there's going to be time between that being fulfilled. And we see Paul arguing the same. Now, Paul is in 2 Thessalonians, he's about 12 years, maybe give or take, from Jesus's life. So he's one of his very earliest books was 2 Thessalonians. One of the things I'm really excited about, and it's probably going to happen about 4 weeks from tonight, is I'm going to teach through the book of Thessalonians, but obviously not verse by verse, because we've only got the time we have. But we're going to cover specifically the prophetic passages in there. And the book of 2 Thessalonians is so cool, and you're going to get, I believe you're going to get so much encouragement from what we're going to look at when we get back to 2 Thessalonians. But I'm going to cherry pick some verses out of here in context, and you'll have to trust me on that till I can prove it eventually. The Apostle Paul is talking to the Thessalonians, and he says, don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day, the day of the Lord, which is it's an Old Testament term for the end times, the tribulation, and so forth. So Paul is saying that day, the day of the Lord, the tribulation, the end times, won't come unless this apostasy comes first. And we're going to talk about that. Trust me, if there's one thing I can guarantee you, we're going to talk about what the apostasy means there. But will not come until the apostasy comes first, and then the man of law, and I added then rather and the man of lawlessness is revealed, or there's an order there. Something called the apostasy happens, and then the man of lawlessness is revealed, and that's the Antichrist, the son of destruction. He opposes and exalts himself above Sorry, this is a little bit smaller. Every so-called God or object of worship, so that he sits in God's sanctuary, um, publicizing that he himself is God. Don't you remember that when I was with you, I told you all about this? So he's telling him some stuff, and he's going, "You guys should remember this. I talked about this." Um, and you will know what currently restrains him, so that he will be revealed in his time. The mystery of lawless is already at work, but the one that's restraining him, and we're gonna come back and talk about all this, but the Antichrist can't be revealed until something that's restraining him is removed. And then once that restraining influence is out of the way, and the lawless one will be revealed. And then here's the key part: the Lord Jesus will destroy him with the breath of his mouth, and will bring him to nothing with the brightness of his coming. When we look at Daniel's the 927, we're going to see that's part of that prophecy. So again, Paul, my point here simply is that Paul is saying, 13 years after Jesus had left the scene, so past the 7 years of the potential 490th week, um, there's still, it's out in the future still. So all I'm saying here is that Jesus and Paul are saying there's a gap between the 69th and 70th week. So I hope that helps you guys understand better this concept of the gap between the 69th and the 70th week. The reason why I've spent a half hour, maybe a little bit more on this gap thing is, again, as I told you, it really tripped me up when I was younger, and I did not understand, and I thought it was made up. I thought it was not true. And when I had it explained to me right, it clicked. And so I'm hoping that that sort of clicks with you as well. So that, again, I like. I'm sorry, I forgot which one you brought up, but we're living in the gap, which is the church age, right? Yeah. So that gap is there. There's a reason for the gap, and it's not just that God decided the 69th and 70th week, should be separated. There was a purpose behind it, and Romans chapter 11 talks about that purpose. It's he's building his church, and eventually that church is going to be complete, and his bride, the bride of Christ, will be fully prepared, and then he's going to come and get his bride. The marriage ceremony of the Jewish people is really cool, and it's got a lot of prophetic significance. So why I'm telling you that is because in about 5 or 6 weeks, probably maybe even the very last week of this class, I'm going to teach through the marriage ceremony of the Jewish people. It may not take me the whole time because it's not terribly long, but there's a lot of prophetic significance in it. And since we're called the bride of Christ, it seems like it's relevant. If Jesus is the bridegroom and we're the bride, then maybe the Jewish wedding ceremony has some significance for us. And I think once I explain it to you, you're going to look at the New Testament passages a different way, because a lot of things that are said in there, we read them with English eyes, with American eyes, but when we understand the concept of the Jewish wedding ceremony, all of a sudden you say, "Oh, that's what that means." Why does Jesus always want us to drink the cup of the communion, the communion? Well, there's some other reasons, but there's another reason that has to do with the wedding feast, and there's a price that has to be paid for the bride. Oh, I'm spoiling all my thing, but there's reasons why it's very significant, and it was another thing that I heard that really made all of this click to me, which is why I want to teach it through with you guys. Okay, we're finally there. Yes.
I just have a quick question.
No. Yes, definitely.
And this is probably something you're going to address in future
Probably.
weeks, so we can just hold off if it is.
That's okay.
When you were talking earlier, or making reference to the Antichrist, to the one of destruction, will the Antichrist know that he's the Antichrist?
Yes.
Or will he just be so filled and puffed up with his human pride and magnificence that he'll just think he's everything, like a god, but he'll actually know that he's the
Yes.
Antichrist? Okay.
Yes, he is.
I've always wondered that.
Yes, and we're going to talk about the Antichrist in a little bit here. So let's go that way, and if I don't fully cover that thing, then I'll come back and do it. But that it's a very good question. Yeah. Okay, so let's look. So the Daniel 70th week. So this prophecy it's very short. So it's going to encapsulate the whole tribulation in one verse. And the reason why, so again, there's a reason why we're here talking about this verse. I could have skipped Daniel's prophecy altogether. It started in Revelations. I could have started in Second Thessalonians. Could have started in Matthew chapter 24. I decided to start here because, well, okay, I get too far ahead of myself here. I'm really excited about some of these things, so I want. Okay, so this one verse, and it's going to have a beginning, a middle, and the end. Now we looked at this verse real briefly last week, and I think we all collectively went, "Ugh." So let's try to pull it apart a little bit and then correspond it with some New Testament passages. And I think we're going to flesh it out a little bit. And then by the time we end next week, we're going to have talked the tribulation all the way through from beginning to end. And I think you'll be able to come back to this verse and say, okay, I get this verse based on everything else we just talked about. Because this verse really is an outline. If you think of it as an outline of the tribulation, then I think that's really what the point I'm trying to make here. So let's start in. So verse 27 here. He will make a firm covenant. So remember, this is verse 20 leads from verse 26, which was talking about the Messiah being cut off and about the people of the prince who is to come. It comes and destroys Jerusalem. And then so we pick up in verse 27 here. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. So this is the beginning of the 70th week. So this is the beginning of that last 7-year period. And it starts with um, he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. And so the first question and the most obvious question is, who is he? And the second most obvious question is, what's the covenant? So verse 26 has two people named. It talks about the Messiah, who we know is Jesus, and it talks about the people of the prince who is to come. So really talking about this prince who is to come. So and we know from other passages, and we're going to look at it, that it's the Antichrist. So he is either Jesus or the Antichrist. So we need to evaluate what's said here and decide which one of the two it is. So some people have argued that he is Jesus and that Jesus came to make a covenant with the Jewish people at the triumphal entry. So he came and he presented a covenant, and that at some point that covenant got broken, but he put an end to sacrifices and offerings in the middle of that, after 3.5 years of presenting that. And so this is where it starts to get a little fishy, and then it sort of peters off toward the end here. But this is a way that people try to make the 70th week happen in the past, is they say this verse was about Jesus and his work in his ministry. And actually, let me be perfectly fair. I don't want to make it sound like it's a crazy theory. Actually, what they do is they don't believe that the first 69 weeks line up with how we believe it lines up, which is that it ends at the triumphal entry. They believe that the coming of the Messiah is the beginning of his ministry. So that 3.5-year period is his ministry on earth. And so when he puts it in the middle to sacrifices and offerings, what they mean is his death on the cross spiritually put an end to the need for sacrifices any longer. Honestly, it's a fair interpretation. If you decide to spiritualize the 70th week, you can make it look this way, and you can make it that first part make a little bit of sense here. But the problem is the second part of the verse, and the abomination of desolation will be on the wing of the temple. So again, talking about the end of the need of the temple, or a desolation that's going to occur to the temple. And so that being, if Jesus put an end to sacrifices, then obviously the temple wouldn't be used for the purpose it was needed. But it also says until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. So if the desolator is Jesus and he desolated the temple by getting rid of the need for the sacrifice, Jesus wasn't destroyed. He died, yes, technically, but that was the beginning of his triumph, not the end of his triumph. He gained more by dying than he did during his life. And so this last part really doesn't fit, although, to be fair, they argue that this has to do with his death. Um, but the problem is that while you can argue that the first 3.5 years were his ministry on earth, you can't really argue the second half. There was nothing of significance in the in the three half years after he died. Nothing of significance happens. But they'll go back and tie this to the beginning of the church or the beginning of Paul going out to proselytize the Greeks and so forth, or Peter maybe with uh, I'm trying to think of the very first Peter, the first Gentile that Peter, and I can't think of it. But anyway, so Peter was the first one. He was told by God to Cornelius. Thank you. Yes. So he went there, and he was told by God to go there, and he preached, and they were saved. And he was saying, I don't want to preach these unclean people. And God gave him a vision that made a point that says, don't call unclean what I call clean. And so he witnessed to him, and we had our first Gentile converts. And so honestly, I make it sound a little poo-poo. Just reading that verse, you could sort of read all of that in there, and it makes a logical set of sense. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't tie in with the rest of the Bible. And so making that verse mean what it means is nice and cute and everything. But you remember, these verses have to tie in with what the rest of the Bible says about this. So let's look at this first part here. He will make a third covenant with many for 1 week. So let's look at that first part in Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, where I think this is another view of what's happening here. So this is called the judgments of the Lamb. And what's happening is this is the beginning of God starting the tribulation, where he's pouring out his wrath on the world, or at least this is what I see it meaning.
Okay, so 927, the first part.
The first, yeah, this is just about.
The first part.
Here's what I'm trying to argue here, and I'm trying to argue that he here better explains the Antichrist based on what we're going to look at
Right.
than Jesus, and I'm going to bring other scriptures to bear to support that. Yeah.
So that part I was getting. So
Okay.
okay, now the next was the Revelation.
Right.
This refers to the first part.
Yeah. So this is
That's
and we're going to come back to this. So this is not something I'm necessarily trying to introduce right now. The seal judgments. We're going to come back and talk about this in more detail. The only reason I'm bringing it ahead early here is I want to tie the fact that my argument of he being somebody who's starting this covenant, being the Antichrist, is sort of backed up by Revelation chapter 6, which is also at the beginning of the tribulation, and we see this talked about here. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals, and this is the first one. And I heard the voice of 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and there was a white horse. So I think everybody's heard of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This is the first horse. And there was a white horse. The horseman on it had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he went out as a victor to conquer. So we know at the beginning of tribulation that from other passages too, which again we'll get into this in more detail a little bit later. But the point I'm trying to make here is this is the Antichrist, and we're going to look at why it is. And this, I'm sorry, I keep doing that. I apologize. If I don't move forward in the verse, just somebody say something to me, because I've got them here and I forget that I'm reading it off here rather than I should be reading it off there, then I won't forget. Anyway, so the horseman on it had a bow. So why that's significant, and I'm gonna explain this first a little bit because I don't know if I'll get into this much detail later. The bow is significant because if he had a sword, typology in the Old Testament prophecies have some bearing here. When somebody goes out with a sword, and we'll see in Revelations plenty of people having swords, including Jesus. And interesting, his sword isn't wielded by his hands; it's wielded out of his mouth. And I think that has some prophetic significance too, which hopefully we'll talk about at some point. But the fact he has a bow instead indicates that he doesn't confront people directly, and it's most prophecy people I've heard explain this They talk about this being he's conquering not by by military might, but by diplomatic um, means. And so he's gaining his political power. The rise of the Antichrist isn't going to be like Adolf Hitler, where he came with big armies and tried to take over the world by military force. The Antichrist is going to come and he's going to get his power from political means. He's going to come and make agreements with people. He's going to move into political situations where there's a gap, and I'm going to stop. I was about to say something. I'm going to pull back. He's going to come by political means, and that why that's important is tying back to this verse. He will make a covenant with many for 1 week. We didn't talk about it, and I'm not going to take the time to prove it to you, but even in Daniel, the book of Daniel, the many refers to the Jewish nation. There's a passage in Daniel chapter 11, and I didn't put it in my notes, which is one of the reasons why we're not going to go to it, but it talks about the many being the Jewish people. So when this says he will make a firm covenant with many, what that's actually saying is whoever he is will make a agreement, and we call it a peace treaty with the Jewish people for 1 week. So it's what's going to happen here is a lot of people who are pre-tribs people believe the beginning of the tribulation will start with a peace treaty with somebody and the Jewish nation. And it's going to be a peace treaty that's supposed to last for 7 years. And so again, I'm not going to show all the support right now. I'm just trying to explain Daniel 9:27 at this point. So I'm going to say that I'm going to stop there for now, knowing that we're going to come back and pick that thread back up later. I just want to get through this verse. And I honestly thought that we would be finished with the book of Daniel, and I would be into other things tonight. But it's looking like, based on the time, I took a lot longer here than I thought. Mainly because, and I will say this, having listened to the recording last week, it taught me something, which is I try to go too fast through things, and I'm glad to see the nods because that confirms. And so what I'm trying to do is purposely slow down, and if that means it takes me longer to get through the material, I'm fine with that. So I intentionally did this on purpose to go a little bit slower, and I'm glad. I mean, the clock's confirming that
Can we go
it
beyond
worked.
6 weeks?
Yeah, can't we just extend by a few weeks? I mean, I'd rather have have insightful information.
I'm gonna go. I have what I think God has laid in my heart to teach. And if it goes 7 weeks, then I'll probably stop after 7 weeks and say, well, if you want to come back, we can like do prophecy updates where I talk about what's going on in the world and stuff. But reality, when I'm done with my material, the class is probably going to be done. If it goes 9 weeks, which my original plan is it would, then that's what we'll go. If it so happens that I'm dragging behind a week or two, I might say, hey, if you guys want to, I'm going to talk about this next week. Anybody who wants to come can come. So yes, so that's potentially possible as we could go longer, but I'm not sure that's going to be necessary yet. But I am going to make a concerted effort to slow down, and I brought all that up just because the clock tells me I've succeeded. Okay, let's get through this verse. If nothing else, I got to get through this verse tonight. So, in the middle of the week, so again, just to set it up, we're talking about the 70th week here, which is a 7 year period, and it's going to start with in my opinion, the Antichrist making a peace covenant, a peace treaty with the nation of Israel that's supposed to last 7 years. But what's going to happen is in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and offerings. And um, and the abomination of desolation will be on the wing of the temple. And so this middle part here, so it talks about the middle of the week. So we're talking about a 3.5 year gap or period here. Um, he is going to put a stop to the sacrifices and offerings. Well, how is he going to do that? Is he going to pass a law? Is he going to come to an agreement? Well, what it says is there's this abomination of desolation that's going to take place. And again, this, if you remember in Jesus right there, he talks about when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place. So it's something that happens where it happens in the temple itself. So what's literally going to happen is he's going to make the temple unholy. He's going to desecrate it. A lot of people believe that what, and again, this isn't supported by scripture, but I will throw this out to you as a little nugget. A lot of people think what he's going to do is he's going to set him up to be worshipped. Now that was talked about in Second Thessalonians, the verse we talked about a bit. He's going to set him else to be worshipped in the temple of God. Some people also believe that he's going to sacrifice and kill a pig in the temple and spread the blood in the temple, and that would make the temple unholy at that point, and it wouldn't be fit for the Jewish people to be able to offer sacrifices any longer. And that's based on Old Testament passages. But I don't want to get too far on that. He doesn't destroy it, but what he does is he sets him up. He literally, what's believed is, and again, there's some scriptural proof to that. He's literally going to come in and tell people, I am God. You're Jewish people. See, the Jewish people, this peace treaty, in my belief, and we'll get there next week now. I just thought we were going to get there tonight. But in my belief, this peace treaty is going to allow the Jewish people to build the temple. And I believe that's how the temple is going to be rebuilt, is this part of this agreement is going to, and so again, I want to connect the dots on how we get from here to there. And I might still do it tonight. I still think I might have a little bit of time. But he's going to come in and say, or the Jewish people are going to really think that this guy is awesome. And some people are even going to think he's their Messiah, the Messiah that he's been waiting for. But he's going to go in and set himself up to be worshiped. And they're going to realize that's not the Messiah, because he wouldn't desecrate his own temple like he's doing. And so it's believed by most people that at this point, the Jewish people are going to realize that not only is this person not their Messiah, but this is going to be the point where people start to realize that Jesus was the Messiah. And so there's some dots that need to be connected for them to get from that thought to that thought. And I hope to talk about those dots, how those dots might connect from a logical perspective, not from necessarily a prophetic passage, because God doesn't go into that much detail. But logically, I like to think about these things and say, well, how do you get from there to there? And then logically try to fill that gap. So I'm going to see if I can do that. But anyway, the important part is, and then again, this is something that Jesus talked about. The temple is going to be desolated, and at that point, the Antichrist is going to be moving on to attack the Jewish nation. And at that point, this thing that is called the Great Tribulation, and is also called the time of Jacob's trouble, that's going to be what happens next. And Israel is going to go through intense persecution, even greater than the Holocaust. And the book of Zechariah talks about 2/3 of the Jewish nation that's alive at the point of the beginning of the tribulation is going to be wiped out. But 1/3 of the Jewish nation is going to be preserved through that, and they're going to come to a saving faith in Jesus. Okay. All right. So I throw a whole bunch at you, so I'll back up a little bit now.
Yeah, well, no, I want to,
Okay.
so the verse that we're studying, the 927.
Right.
So the third part is,
So the second part is the mid part, which is
right,
this abomination of desolation, which is the Antichrist desecrating the temple. So that's the important part. And then again, I throw Matthew up here as also talking about the same point here, and specifically this connects it to the temple, and that's why I brought this verse in. It's because this specifically, and again, Daniel 9 also talked about the temple, but I wanted to reinforce the fact that this is standing in the holy place. The abomination of desolation is gonna be part of that is going to be standing in the holy place, which is the holy part of the Jewish temple. So, all right, so we're almost done here. We're at the last part here. So the last part of we talked about Daniel 9:27 being a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so this last part is the end of the tribulation here.
Don,
Yeah.
quick question.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
stuck back on the second part. The
Okay.
wing of the temple. What does the wing of the temple mean?
Not completely sure how the word wing applies to it.
It kind of sticks out there, kind of weird.
Yeah, and quite frankly, I think that part of this is the translation I picked. I picked the whole maybe because that's sort of Kurt's version of the Bible. There's the word wing doesn't appear in like the English
yeah,
ESV.
one thing is, it's not like a physical wing.
I don't think so.
I think it's
I think it's talking in more of a metaphorical sense, a wing like a bird wing. I honestly, I've never heard that part of it gone through, so I won't try to teach out of my ignorance. Um,
I'm just curious.
yeah, it's a good question and one I don't know the answer to. So at the end of the tribulation, after the 3.5 year period is over with, this is the end of the Antichrist. So the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. So the Antichrist goes in and desolates the temple. He's going to persecute the Jewish nation. I'm going to show you all of that. And then at the end, the Antichrist is going to be destroyed. So this 7 year period, the Antichrist is going to get 7 years to reign on this earth. The first 3.5 years, he's going to do it as a nice guy, sort of a political guy. He's not going to really be nice, but it's going to be like Biden's nice. I shouldn't say that. It's going to be like, well, okay. Anyway, I already said it.
Yeah.
It's going to be like he's going to seem like a nice guy and he's going to seem like a good fella, but the things he does are going to sort of be a little bit cutthroat, but not enough where people think people are going to generally like him, you know. And then he's going to, midweek, something happens in heaven, and we're going to talk about that. And the second half, he really turns and he becomes very, very, very bad person. And he's going to rule the earth with an iron fist. And it's not going to be a fun time to be on earth. So we're going to get there, promise. Um, so again, the decreed destruction, Second Thessalonians talks about it and talks about this lawless one. And then it talks more specifics here. The Lord Jesus will destroy him with the breath of his mouth and will bring him to nothing with the brightness of his coming. Okay.
All right, so this is the third thing?
This is the beginning, middle, and the end. So this is the end. Daniel 9:27, this decreed destruction that's poured out in the desolator. I'm tying this into Second Thessalonians that talks about when Jesus comes. It says that the brightness of his coming, the Antichrist is going to be conquered, destroyed. And we'll look at that a little bit. Revelation talks specifically about what happens there. But again, I'm just really trying to point out here this verse, the simple verse. This is like an outline. And the reason why all right, look here. So this is sort of an outline of the 7 year period. We've got the peace treaty. We've got the midpoint where the Antichrist desecrates the temple. The Jewish people go on the run. He rules with an iron grip and special powers for this last 3.5 years. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. We'll get there. And then Christ's second coming. And this is the end of Satan's reign and the beginning of every good thing. So this will be the worst period in human history, and it will be followed up with the best period in human history. So it's the difference will be tremendous.
So we'll cover when the other 6 seals are broken.
Not in terrible detail, but we will cover them lightly, a light touch on them. But I will cover the seals a little bit heavier than the rest of the judgments, only because, and Pastor Matt will appreciate this, because there's some disagreement about the seal judgments and when they occur. So put a pin in that. That will be a topic of conversation. To wrap up here with Daniel's 70th week, remember this fact is key to understanding the New Testament prophecy. The tribulation is Daniel's 70th week. So if you look at that and realize that Daniel's 70th week is the outline, then you can start to put together some of the New Testament prophecies that sort of don't really reference it specifically, although some do. But the reason why this is important is because Jesus, Paul, Peter, I'm thinking Jude. All of these are New Testament writers that wrote about the end times. All of these people knew this prophecy of Daniel. This was understood fact to them. This is like us understanding the Revolutionary War and the war for independence and George Washington and the crossing of the Delaware, and maybe not all of us knows all of the thing about it, but we understand the basic concepts of the Constitution being written, and all that kind of stuff. As a people, that's part of our shared history. For the Jewish people, the people we're talking about, again, Jesus, Paul, Jude, Peter, these are people that were steeped in the Jewish traditions. They knew Daniel's 70th week. And so when John, another one who wrote obviously the book of Revelation, they all understood Daniel's 70th week. So when they talk about something in their brain, they're thinking that, okay, this is background that everybody knows. Like when I get up and talk about laptops to somebody 40 years ago, I could say the word laptop and they had no concept of what I'm talking about. But I can come here today and say, hey, my laptop wasn't working tonight. And everybody would understand what I meant because there's a shared commonality there. There's a shared experience. And this prophecy is their shared experience. And so understanding it's not much. There's very little actually here in the book of Daniel, but there is enough here that most of the New Testament prophecies are hung upon it. And I think that the reason why some people go astray in their end times philosophies or their thoughts on it are because they don't understand this prophecy well. So that's why I started here. That's why I spent 2 weeks on this prophecy. Is I think starting with the foundation here, now we build on this, and now we have this shared experience of this prophecy. And so I can come back and hang things like a Christmas tree. I can come back and put ornaments on it from Revelations and Matthew chapter 24 and Second Thessalonians, and you'll all understand that these ornaments are hanging on top of this tree. And so that's really what I wanted to get done here. I've got a few minutes here, and I think I can do this in a few minutes here. So this last slide is my summary for Daniel's 70th week prophecy. 490 years total. So this will put together the last 2 weeks into one slide. 490 years total. 483 years have transpired already. 7 years remain in the future. This gap exists between the 483 and the 484th year, which we talked about is the church age, which started, on Pentecost and is going right now. And at some day, Romans chapter 11 teaches that at some point he's going to be finished with that, and then God turns his face back towards the Jewish nation. In Romans chapter 11, it talks about that. And then the final 7 years are future, and the final 7 years of the tribulation period. So that's sort of what I want you to take away from the Daniel 70 week prophecy. Okay, I'll leave it there for a second.
So the final seven is actually the tribulation.
Yes.
I'm still confused on that seven remaining.
Yeah.
See.
And so I will tell you that Pastor Matt doesn't agree. Well, as of the beginning of this thing, I'm hoping some of this will convince him that he's mistaken. But we've in our discussions we've talked about, he really believes that the Bible, the book of Revelations, talks about, and I want to fairly represent his viewpoint, not only because I want to be fair to him, but also because I'm recording this and he might listen to it. He honestly believes that the 3.5 year period is explicitly talked about in Revelations, and so he looks at that and he says, I don't see 7 years, I see 3.5 years talked about in Revelations. And he's right, although I do believe that the 7 year period is inferred in Revelations. But I find my belief in the 7 year period, I get it not from the book of Revelations, but I get it from the book of Daniel. I get it from this other thing that I said we were going to talk about tonight, and we'll talk about at some point. Spoiler: it was the Jewish marriage ceremony. I believe that teaches a 7 year pre-tribulational rapture. So we'll cover that eventually. So I get my 7 year theory from other sources. Matt tries to find it in Revelation and doesn't find it there. And I'll be fair, you have to want to find it to see it there. But I think if you want to see it, you'll see it.
In other words, presuming.
Okay, hold on. So James, go ahead.
It seems to me that the first 3.5 years is the setup for the Antichrist to come in, because that's the period where they're going to need someone to do the deliverable, grabbing everybody together, So for me, that first 3.5 years is not going to be good because people are going to be starving, they're going to be having all these disasters. So that 3.5 years is time for the Antichrist to
Right.
come and globally get everyone to accept him. That's how it works.
Yeah, and let me say this, and as an agreement to what you just said, and to build on it, to try to build on it a little bit. I believe the first 3.5 year period will be tribulation for the world, but not for the Jewish nation, that it will be a time of blessing for them. And I believe the last 3.5 year period will be a time of tribulation for everyone. And that's why the second 3.5 year period is called the Great Tribulation. And that's when Jesus said in the book of Matthew, he said, if I didn't step in and shorten that time, if things went along like they are going to happen during the Great Tribulation, nobody would be left alive at the end if I didn't step in and physically stop the Great Tribulation. So he actually says that. So there is a difference between the two 3.5 year periods. We're going to look a little bit at that next week, although probably not in incredible detail, but we will look at that next week a little bit. Dale, you wanted to say something?
No, it was to your, the way you phrased your previous comment before there was that you have to presume something in order to see it.
Oh,
When you look for
I think if you believe in the 7 year period from other sources, and then you look at the book of Revelation, I think it's easier to see the 7 years in there. If you're going into the book of Revelation with, if you say, I don't care about any other book of the Bible, I'm just going to look at the book of Revelation, then the 7 year period doesn't jump out. But then there's a lot of things in the book of Revelation that if you don't have the rest of the Bible to help interpret, and I think again, when I talk about people going astray with unusual viewpoints about the end times, I think they get that from sticking strictly to the book of Revelation and interpreting things in there without using those methods of interpretation need to come from the rest of the Bible. And so I think you never look at a book of Revelation and plant your flag just there. I think you need to have scriptural support from other places. I think that they're not having the proper understanding of it. It's like we talked about the laptop thing. Somebody from 1950 is trying to run with my statement about my laptop didn't work tonight. And they're trying to say, well, obviously his lap is his lap and it has a top. So obviously he was saying he's in medical distress, right? So he took my comment because he didn't have the proper background on it. He made it into a medical condition rather than a technical problem. And so that's the same way with Revelations. I believe if you look at Revelations and don't have the background necessary with the rest of the Bible, then Revelations can easily be twisted to say different things.
Which is interesting because I have this person that I speak with occasionally. He just knows everything. He's not Christian. And so we have lots of discussions. But this helps me in talking about things. And so because he pulls things out of context. And I will have the context so I can put back in there. That's important.
I will tell you that there's no book in the Bible or no chapter in the Bible that I feel is with end times that's more pulled out of context than Matthew chapter 24. I believe that if you look at the setup for that chapter, it's the disciples going to Jesus and talking about the destruction of the temple and the signs of his coming, which are going to be tied to that. And so he's answering that question based on a Jewish perspective. And people want to come in there and put the church in there. So they're taking the second coming of Jesus and saying that's the rapture. It's like, no, that's not the rapture, that's the second coming. And if you stop taking that out of context and read the verses ahead of it, you'll see it's not the rapture. So again, yeah, I agree.
So
Yeah, hermeneutics, yes.
This is what I've been thinking, where Antichrist comes and makes a covenant with Israel. And so he makes a covenant with Israel so they can rebuild the temple. They rebuild the temple.
You're stealing all
within
my
the
thunder.
first 3.5 years.
Uh-huh.
They restore the Ark of Covenant into the temple.
Okay.
So they could have offerings and sacrifices. And when they restore the Ark of the Covenant into the temple, that is when he goes into the temple and he rules from the Ark of the Covenant, claiming that he is God. Because if you take a look at the Ark of the Covenant, you have two angels that are wingtip to wingtip.
Mm-hmm.
So he could be ruling from that wing.
Okay. That's a valid theory. There's nothing you said that's not scripturally supported there.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily agree with what you said, but it's all opinion based at this point. So
And he will reign there until Christ comes and destroys him.
that much I think I can agree with you on.
So that even the very elect.
Now that's a verse that you can pull out of context.
So,
Who's the elect in that passage? So
I don't know.
right, that from Matthew. It's, again, that's Matthew chapter 24. Elect is well. Anyway,
Yeah.
don't get me started.
because he could say,
Okay.
who but God can rule from the Ark of the Covenant?
So Shell, I've been ignoring you for a while, so I'm gonna.
The 490 years, I'm trying to add this up, my math is not coming up right.
That's okay.
So you got 483, and then each of those 7 years is one more year, right?
Now, so the 7 years are literal 7 years. So 483 plus 7 is 490. So there's not 7 years of 7. So we did have. So this is actually in Daniel. It's 1 week, right? It's the 70th week of Daniel. Each week is a period of 7 years, and so yeah. So the first 7 years we looked at was 7 weeks of 7, so it was 49 years. And this one it's just 1 week, so it's literally 7. Yes, yes, that is correct. I did not probably group that. Right. Karen.
Because he shows the 7 years empty. That's why.
Yeah.
So the remaining 7 years is, that makes more sense.
Yes. Honestly, that's not mine, so I'm not going to take the credit for the blame for it.
Is the Antichrist Satan incarnate?
No.
Is he just a human
But
being that's become real evil? I'm trying to.
Bye.
Good night.
So we'll talk about that next week, but I'm going to answer your question. He is a human being, and then something happens to him where he becomes more than a human being. So that's a sort of preview, and we'll talk about that next week. Because yes, something really bad happens. Also, Karen, encouragement to have you come next week. That thing that you asked me about, we're going to talk about next week.
Oh no!
Are you going to miss next week?
Next week I'm supposed to go to it.
Okay.
Huge, and I was going to ask you if I could. Marianne said, "Ask Don if he's zooming it or something."
So I am.
I don't want to miss anything.
Well, so it's going to be all the sessions from here forward are going to be recorded on my YouTube. So I'll send you that link so you'll have it. And then if I didn't answer your question as completely, then you and I will have a one-on-one conversation. Okay. So.
So when you're talking about the gap,
Yes.
and you talk about between 43 and 44,
Right.
the 490 that they're talking about is
The 490 is the entire 70 weeks, right? At the beginning of Daniel 9, chapter 9, verse 23, he said, 70 weeks, this is Gabriel the angel, said, 70 weeks are appointed to you, to your people, and your holy city, so the Jewish people. So 70 weeks total. So 490 years prophetically total. And from the beginning to the end. And the 490 years, at the end of that period, Jesus is going to come and set up his kingdom. And we talked about that last week. So that 490 years, unfortunately, if it was consecutive, we would be in the millennium right now. But unfortunately, it's not consecutive. So the 483 years has been fulfilled. But the 7 years in the future is the tribulation. And then after that, we get the kingdom. After that last week, we get the kingdom.
because I never heard when you talked about the gap, they talked about evolution.
Oh, no. The gap in the prophecy. Between the 69th and 70th week, that's the gap I'm talking about. Now, evolution has nothing to do with what I'm ever going to talk about. So, okay, so we're done for tonight. So, thank you for coming. I appreciate all the great questions, and I hope.